So we recite these ayats. This is from Khutbah Hajj, as you all know. So today, I wanted to take a look at and remind ourselves of some of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has enjoined upon us, that sometimes we take for granted until we get into a situation whereby our memories become sharp and these things come back to us. Last Friday, Jazakallahu khair, the Khateeb talked about conversations, and the personal conversations that we need to have between not only within ourselves, but with the one who created us. And so this is one of the things to want to take a look at. One of the things that happens when human beings are saddled with adversity, they begin to think about what has happened, what has come with them before, and the future. What will things be like if they are able to make it through the adversity that they've been confronted with? Not putting myself in the forefront, but I can speak to that sort of pointedly, because being in the hospital and having COVID-19 and knowing that the deaths that COVID-19 had happened, all the things in my life flashed before my eyes, and not in a lightning flash, but just one continuous play of things that had happened. And I found myself looking at these and then wondering if there was going to be a future at all. Okay? I wasn't afflicted as some. I never had to be put on the ventilator. It wasn't even a consideration. But knowing the deadliness of that virus, the thoughts came. And so I found myself in the middle of the night, sometimes 2, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. From my perspective, having these conversations with Allah. And it focused upon that personal jihad, that striving to overcome my own personal nafs. So I found myself in this lifetime praying and asking Allah for forgiveness for everything that I could think of that I had done that I needed to be forgiven for. And whatever that I forgot and didn't mention, that He would forgive me. Then I started thinking about second chances. Would there be a second chance? On the floor that I was on in ICU, I didn't see people, but I knew people were dying and weren't making it. I could hear the people, the nurses and the technicians talking about the aspect of individuals who didn't make it. And here I was in a situation that seemingly I was going to make it, but wasn't sure. So in looking at that circumstance of having a second chance, is to ask Allah, not bragging, for the second chance, and hopefully to be able to be a better Muslim overall than I had been before. And that if He gave me that second chance, I would strive my best to be able to do it. The danger here is, as Allah mentions in the Quran in too many places, of those who He granted respite to, they made the promise to Him to do what it is that they should, and then they didn't. And this incurs the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah will keep His promise. No one keeps a promise better than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question becomes, when we ask Allah for the second chance, when we ask Allah for respite, are we saying it intrinsically from our hearts, or is just words that are rolling off of our tongue because we're afraid? And the fear becomes very real. The fear becomes very real. Those Muslims, those amongst us who can say with certainty that if death approached them, that they're ready, are few, far in between. Because in reality, when the circumstance comes, that may be a circumstance that could happen, we're not ready. For any number of reasons, we're not ready. The idea of having life come to an end, what does that mean when that happens? From an Islamic standpoint, it means that there's no more opportunity to seek Allah's forgiveness. Whatever the circumstance and the condition that we are in, that's how we'll be resurrected. But at that juncture, and this is the thing, not bragging again about myself, sticking in my mind, was that death, the finality of death, breathing that last breath, no longer the possibility of to ask Allah for forgiveness. Whatever has happened, has happened. But when that final breath comes and death is there, the ability to be able to ask Allah for forgiveness is gone. And the only thing that can happen from that point, if we have dutiful children, and the aspects of Sadaqah Jariyah, or others who can pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us to be forgiven, but the aspect of being able to ask Allah for forgiveness, to enjoy that opportunity that He gives us day in and day out to sincerely seek His forgiveness, when death comes, it's gone. It's not going to happen again. We won't be able to say, "Oh Allah, I was wrong. Please forgive me for the sins that I've committed. Please forgive me for this. Please forgive me for that." When death seizes us by the throat and our ruh, our soul is taken, khalas, there's no more opportunity to ask for Allah's forgiveness. And this in and of itself is a very frightening circumstance, because out of everything that we have now in being alive, our hearts beating, blood flowing through our veins, being able to see each other, to talk to each other, to give salams to each other, to pray for each other. The one thing that is so very valuable is having the opportunity to ask Allah for forgiveness and hoping that He will grant it. So this is one of the things that we have to pay attention to in striving in the personal jihad. That jihad that the Prophet ﷺ has told us is nothing more strenuous than the personal jihad. We have to realize that having the ability to ask Allah for forgiveness is not something that we should take for granted. And this is not saying that anyone who is hearing my voice or seeing me, I'm saying that we have taken it for granted. We have to guard and be sure that we don't take it for granted. Because just as we have it, in the twinkling of an eye, we cannot have it. Other thing to realize is that we don't want to be in a position in struggling in that personal jihad and being honest with ourselves. We don't want to be in a position that we're not being honest with ourselves. Because in that personal jihad, there's ourselves and there's Allah, in terms of Allah being all-knowing. And so what we have to say to ourselves in investigating and looking at ourselves, our weaknesses, our strengths, and those things that make us who we are, is to be perfectly honest about that. Believe me, coming close to death or being in a circumstance where people were dying, that point gets driven home with absolute clarity, beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's related from in Surah Al-Asr that we say all the time, Wal Asr, Innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And so in this surah, Surah Asr, we all know it. And it's related during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that sometime amongst the Sahaba, when two would meet each other, before they would part in saying, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, one of the two would recite Surah Asr as a reminder about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said. And here, even though we talk about Surah Asr, how often do we think about why the Prophet ﷺ said that if no other surah in the Quran had been revealed, Surah Asr would have been enough. It would have been enough. And if we take a look at what it entails, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can swear by anything that he wants, because he's Rabbul Alameen, he's Al-Khalaq, from the Arabic verb khalaqa, which means to create. He is the creator. So he can swear by anything that he chooses, for any reason that he chooses, because he is that. So indeed, mankind is lost. But how often do we reflect and think about that in the terms of what was said about that surah? If no other surah in the Quran was revealed, that would be enough. It would have been enough. So last week and before that, and with Imam Radi and Brother Khalil, they've talked about the work that has to be done. Okay, not only within the community, but look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, because if we really understood Surah Asr and the implication here, he talks about Amal as-Salih, wal Asr, Inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amili salihati, wa tawasaw bil haqq, wa tawasaw bis sabr. There's no achieving paradise. There's no achieving the promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes in this surah without amal as-salih, without good deeds, having patience and practicing righteousness. The question becomes, in terms of our personal jihad, do we have patience and practice righteousness with ourselves? Within ourselves, do we commit and do amal as-salih, the righteous deeds? Because here, Allah is telling us something. Jannah, any other 7 levels of Jannah. And we're taught that we should all ask for Jannatul Firdaus, the highest level, the 7th heaven. And at the same time, to seek protection from the fire. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us here, on a very personal and close level, if we don't individually in our jihad practice the dictates of Surah Asr, then the possibility is that on that day of standing, Yom Qiyamah, we won't be amongst those who receive the account of our lives in our right hand. We may be amongst those, and may Allah forbid this from happening, of those who receive the accounts of their lives in their left hands or behind their backs. And this becomes something that we have to pay very close attention to. So we look at this aspect of striving with one's personal self. We ask Allah for strength. We ask Allah for forgiveness. We ask Allah to be able to overcome what we know we need to overcome. And we have to be careful about things, okay? And pay close attention to things, because sometimes we may fall into doing things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden, and it's not done consciously, but nonetheless it happens. And so we have to pay attention and be aware of these things. In the second khutbah, I'll go across some of those things and try to tie this all together. وقولي قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفر الله وأتوب إليه. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khairul mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. So we have Surah Al-Asr, a constant reminder of what Allah says will be the outcome. Truly man is lost, except for those amal as-salih. In terms of the community, it could be many things. It could simply mean that in light of this pandemic that we've had and are being spread about, that we call and talk to each other. We find out how each other is doing, making ourselves available. We never know. Someone might need to be picked up. They may need to hear a kind voice, okay? And this goes for me first, and that we not just wait until Friday or on Sunday to talk to each other. And I know individuals talk to each other, but this should be something that we do in light of the sunnah that the Prophet ﷺ has left. Sadaqah is so very wide. Just the aspect of picking up the phone and just saying Assalamu alaikum to a person. We never know how that in and of itself may brighten and uplift that person's day and make the day go from being one that they had some trouble with to being one that is a better day and a good day. So our being close to each other. We talk about the new reality that this pandemic has fostered in. And it is a new reality. Looking at everything that's being said, things that we once experienced them probably won't be the same anymore under any circumstances. And now the question becomes, we as Muslims, what do we do? How do we go forward? How do we go forward with each other as a community and that outside community, those outside of our community, not being Muslim, looking at us and see what we do and how we conduct ourselves. The Masjidun-Nur has a long history in Camden. Most of the people my age that I've talked to are younger and that know about Masjidun-Nur and the reputation that Masjidun-Nur had in the forefront of doing so many things. And I know some of us, all of us, are older, can't do those things that we used to do, like we used to do them, but nonetheless, in relating to each other, okay, we can, and find things that we can be able to do that allows us to do amal as-salih, and at the same time to practice righteousness and have patience, okay? This becomes extremely important. One of the things, and I had mentioned about doing things we fall into unconsciously, to use that word if I can, into circumstances that we do that we shouldn't. The Prophet ﷺ said in talking about shirk, there's shirk kabaya, the major shirk. This is where a person, and this is astounding because you would think that no one would ever just deny Allah's existence or just come forth and just worship something in essence with Allah by intention, okay, not believing in Allah, but for whatever the reasons are. And it's amazing here because this word shirk comes from the Arabic verb sharaka, which means to share. But it's also the same word that the word company comes from, sharaka. So they come to the same word. The company aspect of it is individuals come together, they form a company, and they're sharing. They're sharing in whatever it is that they do, work, so forth and so on in the company. Shirk, on the other hand, is a sharing too. It's a sharing that we shouldn't do, joining something and worship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when the Prophet ﷺ talked about shirk, it was the minor shirk that he said that he was so afraid of for his ummah. The shirk sagir, or sagair, the small shirk, but shirk nonetheless. And we know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, that this is the one sin that he will not forgive. The Prophet ﷺ, in one narration, in describing the small shirk, he said it was like trying to find a black ant on a black rock in the middle of a moonless and starless night. That this was the danger of it. Why? Because it comes up so subtly. We do things, things are said, but we don't do things. So, for example, a person sees a circumstance between two Muslims or one Muslim for that fact, and they know it's seeing what their brother and sister doing is not correct. And then they decide, instead of lovingly saying something to them so they can avoid doing that thing again, because the brother or sister doing it may not know that what they're doing should not be done. But the person who does know decides not to say anything. They don't want them to get upset. They fear more of the person getting upset than going to tell them what it is for their sake as sadaqah, what they should not be doing. And how often amongst Muslims has this happened? A person sees and knows what is happening is wrong, but because a person is considered a friend, don't want to get them upset, whatever the reason may be, especially if it's out of fear of them being upset, they decide not to say anything. And that type of fear is only for Allah. It's only for Allah. And this becomes an aspect of the small shirk. And doing that, there's a verb, khafa, in Arabic, khafa yukhufu, which means to fear. And this aspect of fear, in large part, is not that we can't fear other things, but the fear that we have for Allah is not to be shared with anything or anybody else. And when we decide out of fear not to help our brother or sister, even though it's the circumstance that they may be upset, as Allah knows best, we fall into this area of the small shirk, that's sometimes referred to as the hidden shirk. And we have to be careful, so very careful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, I tried to find an ayat, I couldn't, but I will. But he talks about going to war with him. Who in their right mind will want to go to war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's a war that cannot be won under any circumstances at all. None. None whatsoever. But someone says, how does that happen? Sometimes it happens if we're not aware that we rebel against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's very frightening when you hear sometimes a Muslim say, well, Allah will just have to deal with me on this one. If we really understood the impact of that statement, what is that person inviting from Allah when he or she says, Allah will just have to deal with me on this one. This is what I want to do, and this is what I'm going to do. In this circumstance, shirk has been committed, as well as a couple of other things has been committed. So then, the open rebellion against Allah, that puts one at war with Allah, in a war that can't be won. We see different things taking place. Constantly, we as Muslims, we make mistakes, we make errors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this is going to happen. But we have to be mindful about who Allah is in terms of Rabbil Alameen. That every day that He blesses us to awaken, to see another day, because in sleep, what? In sleep we come closest to death. Our souls return to Allah. And we awaken if he, Azza wa Jalla, in his sublimeness, decides to send our soul back to us. If he decides to keep it, then our time is come and gone. But every day that we're blessed to awaken, it's the opportunity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us to re-examine, to look introspectively at what it is to be Muslim, and above any and everything else, why we were put here. For one reason, to worship Allah, Allah alone, to not join partners with him in any shape, way, form, or fashion. And to remember the promise that Allah has made to us, the promise that Allah has made to us to keep us, to protect us, to provide for us, to get us through tough situations, both individually and collectively. He keeps. Without a shadow of a doubt, he keeps. The problem is we don't keep the promise that we made when we said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. We have to get back to observing and keeping the promise that we've made, so that on Yom Qiyamah, on Yom Haq, the day of truth, when the angels are standing in a row, Angel Jibril alayhi salam, and the other angels, as mentioned in Surah An-Naba, and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says on that day, Yom Haq, Haq means right, it also means truth. So one of the narratives, one of the descriptions of Yom Qiyamah, the day of standing, is Yom Haq, the day of truth. And as Allah says in the last 5 ayahs of Surah An-Naba, the first surah of the 30th juz, he said the angels will be standing there with Al-Ruh Qudus, with Jibril. No one will speak unless Ar-Rahman gives us permission to do so. And when they speak, they will only be allowed and be able to speak the truth. And the surah ends with it saying that for the non-believers on that day, they will say, woe be unto us. I wish I was dust. My prayer and my hope for myself and for you, my brothers and sisters, that on Yom Qiyamah, those words don't come out of our mouths. That we will be amongst those to cross the Sirat with the speed of light, obtain genital firdaus, and be in that circumstance where all the fitna and things that we encompass here will be gone. And we can say that indeed, no one keeps the promise like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة في الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا وأنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.